What's up guys, welcome back to the channel. So in our last video we got Proxmox up and running and we walked through the different components to help us get familiar with the GUI. In today's video we're going a little bit deeper as we continue learning about Proxmox, and this time we're focusing on the network side of things. We've got chapters in the description, so please feel free to jump around to whatever parts interest you the most. With that being said, let's go ahead, let's get started. Before we jump into bridge, bonds, and then VLANs, let's first talk about how Proxmox handle networking overall, because it's actually divided into two layers. The first layer is the node level networking. This is where each Proxmox server or node handle its own physical and virtual network interface. This is where we configure things like Linux bridge, bonds, and VLAN interfaces that connect VMs to the outside wall. The next layer is the data center level networking, or what Proxmox calls software defined network, or SDN. This is a newer feature that lets us define network across multiple nodes in a cluster. It includes things like zones, VNets, and controller, and it's more useful once you start managing more than one node. Later in the video, we'll briefly explore SDN just to get a feel for what's possible at the data center level. But for now, let's break down the parts that live on the node level, and we're going to kick things off with the Linux bridge. A Linux bridge works like a virtual switch that connects your VMs to the outside wall through the physical network ports on your device. So when you initially set up Proxmox, it creates a default bridge called VMBR0, and that bridge then connects to your main NIC on your device. So when you connect VMs directly into that bridge, they join the same network as your physical machine. So it's like plugging in the VMs into your LAN directly. At its core, a bridge just lets VMs access your physical network. Now that we have a good idea of what a bridge is, let's go ahead and take a look at that. So we want to click on a node, and once you click on a node, we're going to go to network. And this is where you will configure all of the network configurations that you have to do for a specific node. In this case, my node Labzilla is what I'm trying to work on in regards to network configuration, right? So once I click on it, you're going to see this interface right here. So you see create, revert, edit, remove, apply configuration. All of those are grayed out right now except for create. And then if you move down, you will see name, type, active, auto start, VLAN aware, and all this other tabs, right? So the first two that you see here, EN01 and ENP3S01, these are the physical device on the physical Ethernet ports on my device. So as you can see, type is network device. This means that my device has two Ethernet ports, right? Port 1 and port 2, right? So the way it works is that I can use any of these ports and then attach it to a bridge, which will allow that bridge to facilitate the communication between my device and anything that's connected to that bridge and my LAN network or whatever network that I have that bridge or that port connected to. I hope that makes sense. So these two here are physical device. Now, if you move to the third item on the list, you're going to see VMBR0. So like I said earlier, VMBR0 is the initial bridge that's created when you first set up Proxmox. So when you go through the initial configuration for Proxmox, Proxmox will create a bridge. Then that bridge will be used to be able to communicate with your LAN. So we're going to go ahead and create a bridge. So we're going to go ahead and click on the create button, drop down menu, Linux bridge. It names it VMBR1 because VMBR0 is already taken. So that's perfectly fine to keep things organized. For the CRD annotation, you don't necessarily need to enter that. But if you want to enter that, make sure it's in the CIDR notation. I can never say that word. Make sure it's in CIDR notation. So 10.10. 10.4/24, and then you enter the default gateway for this network or for this bridge. You can do 10.10.10.1 or something like that, and then IPv6 and the IPv6 if you're using that, the CID notation for that, and then the gateway for that as well. But in my case, I'm going to leave that blank for now. And then over here, it tells you, do you want this device to start? You will check the box if you do, and then VLAN aware, we'll talk about that in a minute. You can check this box if you want to, but we'll talk about that in a minute. And for here, since again this port is already being used, we cannot use that port, right? Because you can only use one port per bridge, unless you create in a bond, which we'll talk about in a minute. But in this case, we're creating a bridge, so you need to enter that port that you want to use. So in our case, we want to use ENP3S0, which is this guy, and it's not being used right now. So EN01 is already being used by this bridge. So we want to create a different bridge, right? We're creating a different bridge. So we want to tie that bridge to this port that's not already being used, right? And in comments, of course, you can add whatever you want. Like this is a test. So it looks like this, right? And then you click on create. So basically what it's doing right now, it's telling us that like, hey, I'm going to create, it hasn't created it yet, right? So if you look down here, it tells you that, hey, this is the changes that's going to be applied to this guy. And it gives you all of this other configuration that you need to be aware of before you click apply. So again, it doesn't apply this configuration yet. You will need to come up here and you will need to click on apply configuration, right? So once you click on apply configuration, then this configuration change will be applied. So we're going to go ahead and click. Before we do, actually, I'm going to copy this guy real quick because we're going to talk about this in a minute. This is where you will go to find out all of your configuration for your network interfaces, right? So all of your network interface configuration will be here, right? And we'll take a look at that in a minute. But for now, you click on apply configuration. It says, do you want to apply this change? Pending network changes. You said yes. It's going to go through its thing. And then now we have two bridges. So this bridge, which is tied to this port, and then this bridge, which is tied to this port. Now, both of our ports are being used, and we can attach our VMs to either one of this bridge here. Now, if we go to shell for a second, right, and then let's clear this out. Let's do cat, right, and let's paste that guy in because I'm lazy sometimes. And then you just click enter. So basically what we're looking at here is now we have two interfaces, right? We have VMBR, well, we have two bridges which are connected to our physical Ethernet port, right? So we have VMBR1 and VMBR0. Now, if you want to make changes to this, you can just do nano, right? And then just paste that again. And then just click enter, and then now you can make changes to this. And if you're brave enough, you can use Vim. But yeah, so this is basically all of your configuration changes, and this is where you will come to make all of your configuration changes as you see fit. I'm going to get out of this, and I'm going to clear that, and I'm going to go back to networking. So now if we go to, let's say we go to one of our test devices that I have here. So if you click on this guy and then you go to hardware, right? Let's say it's a summary, and then you go to hardware. So hardware, now you can see your network device, and we can see that this device was connected to VLAN, something I was testing. So we're going to say, hey, I want you to connect to VMBR0. VMBR0 is what we just created. So now all of a sudden, this device is going to use this guy to be able to communicate to the outside wall, so to speak. So yeah, so that's how pretty much you set up a bridge, and that's basically what a bridge is. Next, let's talk about network bonding. So bonding basically just combines two or more physical network interfaces into one for redundancy and performance. So basically you get failover protection if one NIC dies, plus increased bandwidth across multiple links. Proxmox offers several bonding modes. You have balanced RR, which basically spreads your packet across all your interface. You have active backup with one active NIC with failover, and then you have LACP for dynamic link aggregation with your switch. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at bonding. Okay, so now we're going to work on setting up our network bond. So we're at the data center level, want to go to the node level, and we want to go one more time to networking. Same interface. So one of the things that you're going to notice is that now there's a third device attached. The reason for this is that to set up a bond, you need anywhere from 2 to 3 Ethernet ports to be able to set up a bond, because the whole idea for bond is to combine 2 ports, right, as one, so it gives you that redundancy and performance boost that you're looking for, right? So I have 2 ports here that are not being used, this and this, right? So we're going to use that to create a bond, right? So to create a bond, you click on this guy, you click on Linux bond, and it's going to tell you that this is bond 0 because this is the first bond that we are creating, right? And it's going to ask you for the IPv4, it's going to ask you for the gateway, same as creating a bridge. We're going to leave those blank for now. You can enter those if you want, and auto starts if you want to, which in my case is yes. And it's going to ask you, what do you want to use the slaves for this bond? So basically what it's asking you for is which network device or ports do you want to use to be able to configure this bond. In our case, the 2 that are free right now is this guy with a very long name, this guy right here, and then ENP3S0 is also free, which is this guy right here. So basically what we're doing is that, hey, we're telling them use port 1 and 2, this port and this port, to be able to create a bond. and then just kind of unify them and create this one entity that I can use to be able to communicate to the outside wall. Right, so basically that's what we're doing here. And then here, these are the modes that I talked about. So you have different modes. Balance RR is what I talked about earlier. So you can choose between active backup and you have a couple more. So in this case, for demonstration sake, I'm going to click and say balance RR because that's one of the ones that we talked about. And then again, you can add in the comments. This is, it's another test, right? And then once that is done, we're going to go ahead and click on create. So again, the same configuration setting here is telling us that like, hey, you're about to create a bond, this guy right here, and this is the configuration changes for that bond, or the configuration or what is going to be applied for that particular bond. We're going to go ahead and click and say apply changes, and then yes. And it's going to do its thing. A couple of things to keep in mind. A bond, you cannot attach a bond directly to a VM. So if I go to test VM here and then go to hardware and then go to network and then look for that bond here, you're not going to see that because again, you cannot attach the bond directly to a VM. What you would do is you will go back to the node, go back to network, right? And then we're going to create a bridge. What you do attach to a bond is a bridge. So we're going to go ahead and create a new bridge, right? I deleted VMBR1 from the previous example for bridge. So we're going to call this bridge VMBR1 again. We're going to leave this on check. And over here, right, it's not VLAN aware. We're going to talk about that later. Over here, instead of putting in the port directly, we're going to put in the bond. So we're going to say we want to use BOND 0, right? So we're basically telling this bridge like, hey, you are going to be using this bond that we just create to facilitate the communication to the outside wall. So now we're going to click on create. It's going to tell us the changes that's going to be made. We're going to click on apply. We're going to click on yes, and boom. So what we did here is that we created a bond and we attached those two ports to this bond. We create the mode that we want to use for this bond, right? And then we went ahead and create a bridge, and then we attach the bond to that bridge to be able to allow our VMs in our environment to use this bond that we just created through the bridge. I hope that makes sense. So now if we go to any of our devices, just click on it once. You don't need to double click. We'll go to any of our devices, right? And then we just click on network. Now we're going to see that VMBR0 is available. So now if we click VMBR0, we click OK. Now this VM is using our bridge that has our bond attached to it. So that's basically what a bond is in Proxmox. Next, let's talk about VLAN at the VM level. So VLAN basically just lets you split one physical network into multiple virtual network, keeping traffic separated without additional hardware. So it's basically perfect for isolating test environment, IoT device, and guest network. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. Okay, so before we talk about how to configure VLAN on the Proxmox level, one of the things that you have to keep in mind is that you have to have a VLAN structure set up outside of Proxmox before you can use VLAN. So I am going to create a video that talks about end-to-end VLAN setup from the firewall to the switch to Proxmox. But just keep in mind that the VLAN structure needs to be set up outside of Proxmox for you to be able to tag something in Proxmox for it to be able to work. So just keep that in mind, right? For now, I'm just going to demo it. But if you're tagging something in Proxmox with a VLAN tag, and I'll show you guys what that means in a minute, you need to make sure you have that structure set up outside of Proxmox. So to kind of demonstrate what VLAN is and how to tag a VM in VLAN, we're going to go back to the node level. I'm going to go to network. Right, we're going to first go to bridge. So when we were setting up our bridge, you will see that there was a setting that says make this bridge VLAN aware. So when you check this box, what happens is that when a VM sends a traffic that is tagged, and I will show you guys that in a minute, this bridge is aware that a tag traffic needs to be sent to a particular VLAN. Right. So that's basically all that is when you check this box. You're basically telling this bridge to say, hey, be aware that if a traffic comes and it's tagged with a VLAN ID, just know that that VLAN ID needs to be attached in that traffic before you let it outside of Proxmox. I hope that makes sense. So a VLAN aware bridge just is aware of a VLAN tag, and it takes that tag, keeps that tag intact to be able to send that traffic outside of Proxmox to your switch, and then your switch will send it to your default gateway or your router or whatever it is that it needs to be sent to, and then that tag will apply, and then it will kind of separate your traffic based on that particular VLAN, right? So the first thing that you need to do when you're setting up a VLAN, if you're setting it at the bridge level, you need to make sure that at the bridge level, you need to make sure that VLAN aware is checked. And then here, you can select the range of VLAN that you want this bridge to be aware of. That is one way to kind of tie down things a little bit, so you're not wide open to say like, hey, accept any sort of tag that come whatsoever. As you can see, this is a pretty wide range, so you can adjust that accordingly. So once you do that, you can click OK, and it's going to tell you that like, hey, now you can see here, it's going to make changes to this config file to say like, hey, this stuff is VLAN aware, and this is the range that this person has selected. You can physically go into this like I showed you guys earlier and make that configuration changes, or you can just make that configuration changes at the location that I just showed you guys earlier. All right. So once that's done, you click apply, and then yes. Now all of a sudden, this bridge is VLAN aware. So that's the first thing that you need to change. So now to be able to tag a VM with a VLAN ID is that you need to go into the VM and you need to click on networking. Here you say like, hey, whatever VLAN ID that you have set up, again, you need to first make sure that your VLAN configuration is fully configured outside of Proxmox, right? Because if you don't, this is not going to work. Again, I have a video coming out about that, so just keep that in mind, right? So now what you can do is you can get rid of that, and then you can say like, hey, the VLAN tag for this guy is 8, right? And now if you leave this blank, that means that there is no VLAN tag for this VM. But if you don't, you can say the VLAN tag is 8. Right. So now you click OK, and then you choose whatever bridge that we set that up, VMBR0, VMBR1, and then click OK. So now what happened is that every time this VM sends traffic, right? Every time it sends traffic on the network or send traffic to your bridge to be able to communicate in your network, that traffic is going to be tagged with this VLAN ID. Right. So it's going to take, the way it's going to work is that your VM is going to send traffic with this tag to your bridge right here, right? And this bridge is VLAN aware, so it's aware of this tag, and this is the range. And it's like, okay, from here to here, that range is allow, right? Okay, I'm going to put this tag on this VM traffic, and I'm going to bundle that, and I'm going to send that to the bridge, that to the port that is connected to it, and that port is connected to your switch, and that traffic gets sent to your switch, and then your switch looks at it and say like, oh, okay, this stuff have a tag on it, I know exactly where this needs to go, and then it would take that and send it to your router or your default gateway or whatever it is that's above your switch, right? So that's how VLAN technically work, right? So you have your VLAN aware bridge, and then you tag your VLAN on your VMs, and that traffic is now tagged, and it gets sent through your network with a tag traffic. And this computer, depending on how your firewall rules are set up and how your you set up your VLANs, maybe your VLANs are not able to communicate with each other. Now, this computer is not able to communicate with anything outside of that VLAN if you don't want it to. Again, that's why VLANs are very powerful, because they allow you to use one port and segment that port as much as you want to be able to create like that segregation between like your network for better security. So there's another way to tag VLAN traffic in your Proxmox environment, and you can do that at the data center level on the SDN. So if you have SDN set up, or you don't have SDN set up, or you want to configure SDN specifically for VLAN, you go to zone, you go to add, and you add a VLAN zone. And you can call this whatever you want, right? So we can call it test VLAN 1, right? And then for bridge, here you're just basically telling it that's too long. Let's do test VLAN. Here you can tell it basically what bridge you want to use. So you need to check the bridges that you have set up on your node level, because we're going to be attaching it to this node, and we're going to say we want to use VMBR1, right? And then the node that we want to use, of course, is LabZilla, because that's the only node that we have. IPAM is the same. And then DNS, you can configure all of this if you want, and then you click add. So as you can see, this is simple, and this is VLAN. And I'll show you the difference once we set up the VNet here. But this is the zone. So now we're going to go to VNet, and then we're going to say we want to create a new VNet, and we're going to call as VNet VLAN, right? So VNet VLAN, right? And then the zone that we want to use is zone 2. Well, the VLAN zone, right? Because if we choose the simple zone, you're going to see that there is no tag section here. But if we choose the VLAN zone, right, now we have something to tag. So now we can put it directly in here and say we want this VNet that we just created in this zone to have a tag of 8. And then we say VLAN aware. Now, what this is doing is that once we click create, any VM that we attach this VNet to, or any VM that have this VNet attached to it, is automatically going to be tagged with the VLAN number 8. It's a lot more cleaner. You don't have to add that VLAN number to your VM. So you do it at this level, right? So what you want to do is now you can go here, any of this VM, and then you can click on this guy, and now you can click on the drop down. Oh, I forgot to click apply. So go back to data center. If we go back to SDN, any changes that you make, by the way, you need to come to the top level and click apply, click yes. It's going to take a couple of seconds for that to appear here. Let's give it a few seconds. So now our new zone is available and ready to use in our SDN network. So now if we go back to our VM, right, and then we go to network again, double click on that, we should be able to see that here now. So yep, so we have VNet VLAN here. So now every time this VM sends a traffic, that traffic is going to be automatically tagged. Again, just make sure you have your info, just make sure outside of Proxmox, you have that set up, your VLAN configuration set up outside of Proxmox. So your switch and your firewall or all those other things are able to be aware of the VLAN tag that's being pushed through to them, right? So now you can select that, click OK. And now what's going to happen every time this guy sends traffic, that traffic is going to be tagged. So that's another way to kind of tag traffic in your VLAN, in your Proxmox environment as well. You can do it at this level if you have SDN set up. You can just create a zone, a VLAN. Let me go back into zone here. You can just go to zone, create a VLAN zone here, and then create a VNet added to that zone and make that zone VLAN aware. So let me double click on that, make that zone VLAN aware, and then tag it from here. So those are the two ways, well, a couple of ways actually, but those are kind of the things that you need to do if you need to tag a VM in your environment and you want that VM to be VLAN aware. There's also the Linux VLAN interface, which is on the host side. So basically, if your Proxmox host itself needs to talk to a VLAN, example, let's say for storage or management, you'll create a Linux VLAN interface. For the most part, you may not need this in a small lab environment, but it's important for advanced use cases. So it's something to keep in mind. I'm not going to talk about it in detail here because a lot of small lab environments don't use this, but that's something to keep in mind in case you want to put the host itself on a VLAN. This is the VLAN configuration that you will use for that. Next, we're going to talk about software-defined network, which is SDN. SDN basically just lets you centrally manage network configuration across multiple Proxmox nodes from one interface. So instead of configuring each node separately, you build virtual networks, zones, and controller that are fully integrated into Proxmox. There are a few components that we need to understand about SDN. First, you have zones. So think of zones as the container where your SDN network lives and operates. So when you create a zone, you're defining how your virtual network should behave. So whether it stays local to a single node or span across your entire Proxmox cluster. There are key types of zone that you need to be aware of, one of which is simple. So this is basically basic single node network setup. And then you have VLAN, which basically integrates with your physical VLAN infrastructure. And then you have things like VXLAN and EVPN. These are basically advanced multi-node clustering setup. Next, you have VNets. So VNets are basically virtual network where VMs actually connect. They live inside of your zone and act like a virtual switch. So you can set things like VLAN tagging, MTU, and DHCP option all on the VNet level. Next, you have IPAM. IPAM is basically IP address management. IPAM basically tracks IP address in your SDN setup. You define the IP range and the gateway for each of your VNets separately. And Proxmox automatically track which IP address are assigned to which VMs. So one of the things to keep in mind is that Proxmox does not come with DHCP support for SDN network out of the box. So if you enable DHCP in a VNet and try to apply it without DNS mask installed, you will get an error. You will need to install DNS mask if you plan to use DHCP inside a VNet in your Proxmox SDN. So SDN lives at the data center levels. All of the configuration that we've been making so far are at the node level. So now we're going to move away from the node level to the data center level. So click on data center. We're going to minimize permission, and you're going to see SDN. So in SDN, if I minimize that, expand that again, you'll see zone, VNet, options, IPAM, and VNet firewall. We'll talk about each of this in a minute, but if we click on the top level here, you'll see that there's already one SDN, and that's a local network. That's a local network configuration that's created when you set up Proxmox. The Proxmox server creates this initially, right? But for us to create our own SDN, what we want to do, the first thing you need to create when you create an SDN is a zone. So you click on the zone, you click on add, and there's a different types of zone that I talked about earlier. In our case, we're going to do simple. So for ID, you can just call this zone whatever you want. In my case, I'm just going to call it test one for now, right? And then for MTU, it's on auto. You can adjust that as you see fit. For node, we only have one node, which is Labzilla. So we're going to go ahead and click on Labzilla there. And then for IPAM, we're going to use PVE because PVE is the internal IPAM that came pre-configured with Proxmox. So that's the only thing that we can select here. For DNS server, you can add a DNS server in the zone if you want to. We're not going to do that. Reverse DNS, same concept, and then DNS zone, you can add that as well if you need to. We do need to check this box because we do want automatic DHCP or want DHCP to be turned on for the zone. So make sure you check this box, and this will come into play in a minute because if you don't check this box and then you have IPAM, IPAM is basically not going to assign any IP address because DHCP is not turned on, right? So make sure you turn DHCP on if you want the zone to be able to assign IP address automatically, right? So click on that, and basically we just click add. So that just created our first zone. So that's the first step when it comes to SDN. So the next thing we want to create now is a VNet. So you will need to create a zone first before you can create a VNet because your VNet lives inside of your zone. So click on VNet, click on create, and here you can call this VNet whatever you want, right? So I will call it VN test 1. And then alias, I'm going to leave that blank. For zone, you can choose the zone. We only have one zone. Again, you will need to have a zone for your VNets to live inside. So you will need to create your zone first before you can create your VNet. Here, you can make this VNet VLAN aware if you have your VLAN set up. If you don't, you can uncheck that, right? And then here, you have isolated ports. You can check that as well if you want to. And then you click on create. So now we have our zone, which is this guy. And then we have our VNets, which lives inside of our zone. And the next thing that we need to do is that we need to create our subnet for this VNet, right? So what we want to do is we're going to go ahead and create. And then here, what it's asking us basically is saying that like, hey, what do you want this subnet to be? So I'm going to make it 10.10.10.0/24, right? So I'm putting this in CIDR notation, and you can choose whatever you want here. And then for gateway, it will be 10.10.10.1. That's the default gateway. And you need to make sure you check this guy right here, right? So the SNet, make sure you check that because what that is basically doing is facilitating the communication of the subnet outside of your Proxmox environment. If you do not check this, this subnet cannot communicate outside of your Proxmox environment. What that means is that the subnet can communicate with things inside of your Proxmox environment. So all of your VM inside of your Proxmox environment will be able to communicate with it. But outside, meaning going to the internet and going outside of your environment, it will not be able to facilitate that communication. If that's what you're looking for, you can go ahead and uncheck that. But if that's not what you're looking for, make sure you check this box. And for DNS zone, you can enter, let's say, define a DNS zone prefix here if you want to, but I'm going to leave that blank for now. I'm going to go ahead and click on create, right? And then once you create it, now you know that you see that you have your VNet and you have your subnet. I'm going to click on that one more time because there's one more thing that we need to configure in here. So if we click on that, right, you're going to see DHCP range. You need to configure this because remember when we set up, if we go back to our zone here and we click on that, we told our zone that, hey, this zone as long as it has a subnet, it has an IP to assign, turn on DHCP and let this zone assign IP address automatically. So since this is turned on, we need to give it a DHCP range. So if we go back in here, we click on there. So for DHCP range, we're basically telling the subnet that, hey, from this range to this range, you can assign an IP address. Anything outside of that range, do not assign that IP address. Say add right here, and then we're going to do 10.10.10. Let's say from 5 for the tab, and then we can do 10.10.10 to 253. Yeah. We're saying that anything from 5 to 253, you can assign an IP address if something gets attached to the zone and it requires an IP address to be able to communicate, or require an IP address to be able to go outside of the Proxmox environment. You can assign that device anything between 5 and 253. So once we click OK, now we can see that, hey, we will have our zone, right? And then in our zone, we have our VNet. And in our VNet, we have our subnet, right? And then all we have to do, technically, this is all we need to be able to create a zone. So all we have to do now is go back to the top level, click apply, so we can apply all of those changes. It's very important for you to click apply, because if you do not click apply, it's not going to work, right? So now you see that it's only local. Still, let me expand that. There's only the local thing here. So if we give it a couple of minutes or a couple of seconds, not a minute, you're going to see now we have our zone. Right, so we have a zone, we have which node the zone is applied to, and then we have the zone as being available. So now we should be able to see our newly created SDN. So as you can see, test 1 in there, we have our zone, and in our zone we have our VNet, and in that VNet we have our subnet enabled, which DHCP is turned on. So anything that this VNet is attached to should be able to pick up one of this IP address. So to attach one of our VMs to our VNet, all we have to do, or let's say our SDN, right? All we have to do, because you can only, just to be clear, you cannot attach your VM to a zone. You can only attach your VM to the VNet, because the VNet is technically the switch. So again, a VNet acts as a switch in the zone, right? So what we want to do is we want to go to one of our VM. We want to click on hardware. And then we want to do it the same way we did for our bond in our bridge, right? Double click on that. And then we want to say use VNet VN test 1, which is what we call our VNet in our zone. Click OK, right? And then now if we go back to data center, we'll go back to SDN. Now, ideally, if we come to our IPAM, we should be able to see like a full tree of like the default gateway, the IP address, and all that good stuff. So if we click on that, we see this guy right here. So we see our VNet, right? So we have our zone, which is test 1. We have our VNet in that zone, which is VNet test 1. And in that VNet, we have our subnet. And in that subnet, we have two things there. We have our default gateway, and then we have this VM that is now attached to that. So you can see that this is very powerful, right? So if you have a Proxmox environment where you say, hey, I don't even want this Proxmox environment to be able to go outside to be able to communicate with the other devices, you can set this up where all of the communication is done internally and nothing goes outside unless you want it. If you want to be a lot more organized and you'd be like, hey, I want to set up my network and set up everything, my subnet inside of Proxmox. So if I was to migrate Proxmox and go somewhere else, I can just go restore it there, and all of my network configuration, my subnet, and all of these things is already pre-configured. And all I have to worry about is just connecting my device to the internet, and then boom, I'm good to go. It's a very powerful way to be able to manage your network internally inside of Proxmox, and don't worry about anything outside of Proxmox if you don't want to. So a couple of things to keep in mind is that with your VNets, you have VNet firewall. So we have our VNet. So now you can add rules, you can set up different set up security groups and do different things in regards to firewall. Here you also have options. So you can have controller. These are designed for much more complex like routing protocols. For a Homelab, you're probably not going to touch that. To be honest, for a Homelab, you're probably not even going to touch VNet, not unless you really want to learn about it and you want to kind of really play and understand it. I'm obsessed with like kind of understanding the nitty gritty of things. So I always dive a little bit deeper. But then you can set things like this up. For IPAM, as I said before, the one that is being used is PVE because that's the internal one. You can add a different one if you want to. And of course, you can add a DNS provider here if you want to add a DNS provider outside. Bring a DNS provider from outside to bring it in. So as far as SDN go, that's kind of like the foundation of it. Again, it's very complex in a way, right? For a small home lab, for a very basic home lab, you would probably not touch this at all, but it's part of the Proxmox networking, and it's a really, really powerful tool. It's a way for you to kind of segment in things a little bit more. So as far as SDN go, that's pretty much all there is to it. That is it for this video on Proxmox networking. We've covered everything from node level networking to SDN, including things like bridge, bonds, VLAN, VNets, and IPAM. So hopefully now things feel like a lot less confusing and you've got a really good starting point for managing network inside of Proxmox. If this video has been somewhat helpful to you, please do not forget to like the video, comment if you have any questions, and subscribe if you haven't done so already. As always, guys, don't forget to stay geeking. I will see you guys on the next one. Peace.